Montana Territory, October 1877. The aspens had already turned. Gold light spilled across the valley like something the land was giving away before winter took it all back. The creek ran thin and cold. The mornings came sharp-edged with frost that melted by noon but left a warning behind. Every blade of grass, every bare branch, every shadow creeping longer across the dirt said the same thing. Time was running out. Rachel Hadley stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched her husband load the wagon. She held Thomas on her hip. The boy was 4 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that watched everything without understanding most of it. He had his thumb near his mouth. Rachel did not pull it away. She did not have the energy for small corrections today. Grace stood beside her mother, 7 years old, thin, quiet, her fingers wrapped around the edge of Rachel's skirt. She watched her father move back and forth between the cabin and the wagon carrying things. A sack of flour, the good rope, the tin box where they kept money. She watched him with the focus of a child who senses something wrong but cannot name it. James Hadley was 34. Broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, hands that could split wood or gentle a horse. He had been a good man once, or maybe he had been a man who was good at seeming good. Rachel was no longer sure. What she knew was this. Over the past year, he had stopped looking at her when he spoke. He talked about the West, Oregon, California. He said the words the way a man says a woman's name when he is already in love. Not with excitement, with certainty. He said he was going to Fort Benton, supplies for winter, nails, salt rope, medicine. He said he would be back before the first snow. He said it while looking at the horizon, not at her. He took the wagon, he took the plow horse, the only horse they had. He took most of their savings from the tin box. He left Rachel $11 in coin and a promise shaped like a sentence he had probably practiced in his head. I will be back before the snow comes. He kissed Grace on the top of her head. He kissed Thomas on the cheek. He did not kiss Rachel. She noticed. She had been noticing for months. You notice the absence of small things long before the big things disappear. The wagon pulled away down the dirt road that led out of the valley. Rachel watched it. Grace watched it. Thomas watched it without knowing what he was watching. The wheels left tracks in the soft earth. The horse moved slowly as if it too was uncertain about the journey. Rachel stood there until the wagon rounded the bend and vanished behind the tree line. She stood there a little longer after that, not waiting, just standing. The way you stand at the edge of something before you step forward into whatever comes next. She went inside. She put Thomas down. She fed the children cold biscuits and the last of the bacon. She cleaned the dishes. She stacked wood near the stove. She moved through the rest of the day with a steadiness that came not from calm, but from the refusal to stop moving. Because if she stopped, she would have to think. And if she thought, she would have to admit what she already knew. He was not coming back. She knew it the way you know weather. Not from logic. From the feeling in your bones, from the pressure in the air, from the thousand small signs that add up to one large truth you have been looking away from. James had not packed like a man going to buy supplies. He had packed like a man leaving. He took the good blanket. He took his father's knife. He took the small photograph of his mother that he kept in his shirt pocket. A man going to Fort Benton for nails and salt does not take his mother's photograph. 1 week passed. 2, no letter, no word carried by passing wagons or riders moving through the valley. By the 3rd week, Rachel stopped walking to the road to look. She did not announce this decision. She did not cry. She simply stopped. The way a river stops when it freezes. Not gone, just still. She had 2 children. She had a failing cabin. She had 6 weeks before the valley locked itself in ice. And she had no legal claim to the ground beneath her feet. That was the part that cut deepest, not the abandonment. She could survive abandonment. She had been surviving it in small doses for over a year. What she could not survive was the law. The cabin sat on a homestead claim filed by James Hadley in 1874. His name, his claim. Under Montana territorial law, a married woman had no independent right to a homestead claim. The land belonged to the man who filed. If the man left, the claim remained his. If he did not return, the claim would eventually lapse and be open for new filing. Either way, Rachel had no standing. 3 years of labor. 3 years of planting and mending and hauling water and patching walls and keeping the stove lit Through nights so cold the nails in the walls popped like gunshots. None of it counted. The law did not measure effort. The law measured names on paper. She learned this on a cold Tuesday in mid-October. She walked 7 miles to the land office in the small settlement near the valley's southern mouth. Thomas rode on her back in a sling made from a flour sack. Grace walked beside her holding a stick she had found, using it as a walking staff, the way she had seen adults do. The land office was a single room attached to a general store. Behind the desk sat Calvin Rhodes, a man of about 30 with careful eyes and dark hair combed flat. He was not unkind, he was precise. He dealt in facts and papers, in the distances between property lines, and he understood that the law was not the same thing as fairness, but that his job required him to enforce the first and ignore the second. Rachel asked about the claim. Calvin explained. His voice was even measured, almost gentle, in the way that a man's voice becomes gentle when he knows the words he is delivering will cause pain and there is nothing he can do to soften them. The claim was in James Hadley's name. Without his presence or a legal document transferring ownership, Rachel had no authority over the land. She could remain through the winter. No one would remove her in the cold months. But come spring, if James had not returned, the claim would be reassessed and potentially open for new filing. Rachel listened. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. When Calvin finished, she asked one question. I have lived there 3 years. I planted the garden. I repaired the cabin every spring. I hauled water every day. I kept the land through 3 winters. Does that count for anything at all? Calvin looked at the desk. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he said, I understand, Mrs. Hadley, but the law does not count labor. It counts the name on the filing. Rachel nodded. She picked up Thomas. She took Grace's hand. She walked 7 miles back to a cabin that was not hers on land, that was not hers to prepare for a winter that did not care whose name was on any piece of paper. The neighbors learned quickly. In a valley with 4 families spread across 5 miles, news did not need to be spoken aloud. It was observed. The wagon was gone. The horse was gone. A woman was walking 7 miles to the land office with 2 small children on a Tuesday morning. The arithmetic was simple. Henry Dawson rode over first. He was 45, a widower, a cattle rancher with a face like old leather and hands that never fully relaxed. He had known James Hadley for 3 years and had never liked him, though he never said so directly. Men in the valley did not speak about other men that way. They simply watched and kept their conclusions stored in a place behind their eyes. Henry brought salt and dried beef wrapped in cloth. He stood in the doorway too large for the frame and said, If you need anything, Mrs. Hadley. The sentence stopped there, hanging in the cold air between them, incomplete. An offer shaped like a doorway that neither of them would walk through. Rachel thanked him. She took the salt and the beef. She did not ask for anything more. Dorothy Selden came next. The school teacher. 40 years old, unmarried, careful in her dress, and precise in her speech, with a habit of arriving at other people's difficulties, carrying both bread and opinions. She brought a loaf of sourdough and a question that was really a suggestion, wearing the clothes of concern. Do you have a plan? Rachel, winter is almost here. Rachel took the bread. Thank you, Dorothy. Dorothy paused, then lowered her voice. If you needed help making arrangements, there are families who could take the children for the winter months. Good families. It would only be temporary. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Rachel looked at Dorothy for a long moment. Her face did not change. Her voice did not rise. My children stay with me. Dorothy nodded quickly. Of course, I only meant if you needed the option. I do not need that option. Dorothy left. The bread was good. Rachel fed it to the children that evening and said nothing about the conversation. Walter Parrish, the carpenter, did not come at all. He was 50 years old, built thick with calloused hands and a professional pride that sat on his shoulders like a second coat. He had built half the cabins in the valley. He knew what shelter meant. He knew what it required. And he knew with the certainty of a man who had spent 30 years working with wood and nails and square corners that Rachel Hadley's cabin was failing, and that a woman alone with 2 children was not going to survive a Montana winter in a structure that was already losing the argument with the wind. He sent word through his wife. She should take the children to Fort Benton before the first real snow. A woman alone with 2 small ones in that cabin through winter. That is not a decision. That is a sentence for my mom. He was right about the cabin. Rachel knew it too. She had known it for over a year, the way you know about a crack in a dam. You see it, you measure it with your eyes each time you pass. You know it is getting worse. But you keep walking past because the alternative is too large to face until it forces itself upon you. The cabin was 3 seasons old, built in haste in the spring of 1874, when the Hadley family first arrived in the valley. Green pine logs that had warped and shrunk as they dried, opening gaps between them that let daylight through in half a dozen places. A roof of split wood shakes that had begun to rot in the southeast corner, where rain pooled before sliding off. A door frame that had shifted as the walls settled, leaving a gap at the bottom wide enough to slide a hand through. A single window, nothing more than a square hole covered with oiled hide that cracked in the cold and let air seep through like water through paper. And the stove. The stove was the worst of it. A small cast-iron cook stove that James had hauled from Fort Benton the first year, strapped to the back of the wagon like a prisoner. It was designed for cooking, not for heating a 14 by 16-foot room with walls that leaked air from every direction. Rachel could burn wood from sundown to midnight and still wake at 3 in the morning to frost forming on the inside of the walls. By dawn, the temperature inside the cabin was barely distinguishable from the temperature outside. The stove fought the cold every night and lost every night. The cold was patient and the stove was not. Grace coughed. It had started in late September. Not a deep cough, not a sick cough, not yet. A dry, persistent sound that came from a chest that never fully warmed. She coughed in the morning when she first sat up. She coughed at night when the fire burned low. She coughed in her sleep, small sounds that Rachel heard through the dark like signals from a distant shore. Rachel listened to that cough the way a sailor listens to the wind before a storm. It told her what was coming. Not the cough itself, what the cough meant. Cold was inside her daughter's body, and if it stayed there long enough, it would become something worse. Something that could not be fixed with an extra blanket or a warmer corner of the room. She had 6 weeks. 41 days before the valley typically froze solid and the first deep snow sealed the passes and the world contracted to the narrow space between walls and sky. She did the calculations. Without the horse, she could not haul large timber. She could fell small trees with the hand axe and drag them to the cabin, but the work was enormous and slow. Even working every daylight hour, she might manage 3 cords of wood before the ground froze too hard to move on. A typical valley family burned 6 to 8 cords per winter. And even then, even with fires burning through the night, even with men hauling wood until their shoulders gave out and their backs locked up and their hands cracked and bled, the cabin stayed cold. Children slept in coats. Adults woke to ice in their water buckets. Women stuffed rags into gaps that reappeared every spring like the walls were breathing. Rachel had watched this for 3 years. Every winter the same. The cold won. The only question was the margin of its victory. There had to be another way. On October 11th, 2 days after watching the last aspen leaves fall, Rachel walked behind the cabin to the property line. The homestead claim ended where the ground began to rise sharply into the mountain. Beyond the boundary marker, a wooden stake driven into the dirt, and already leaning, the slope climbed steeply through decomposed granite bands of red-brown clay and slabs of dark stone breaking through the soil like the bones of something ancient buried just beneath the surface. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking for something she did not yet have a name for, an answer to a question she had not fully formed. She only knew that the cabin was a losing proposition and that wood was a losing fuel and that everything the valley had tried for years was a version of the same failed strategy. More wood, bigger fires, thicker walls, fight the cold harder. What if you did not fight it at all? What if you found something that was already warm and simply stayed close to it? She climbed the slope. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the metallic edge of approaching frost. The sun had been hitting the south-facing rock face all day, pouring warmth into the stone the way water pours into a vessel. When Rachel reached the exposed rock, she placed her hand on it. Warm, not hot, not dramatic. A steady, deep warmth radiating from inside the stone itself. The sun was already low, the air already cooling, but the rock held what it had been given. It held heat the way some people hold promises. Faithfully, long after the source was gone. Rachel stood with her hand on the stone and she remembered. Summer evenings sitting against the boulders near the creek, the stone warm against her back hours after sunset. Grace pressing her small cheek against a sun-heated rock and saying with the absolute certainty that only children possess, "The rock remembers the sun, Mama. The rock remembers the sun." Rachel did not know the word thermal mass. She had never heard the phrase radiant heating. She knew nothing about conductive heat transfer through dense mineral surfaces or the specific heat capacity of granite compared to pine. She knew what her hand told her. Stone held warmth. Stone released it slowly. Earth surrounded and protected. Earth did not let heat escape the way wood did, the way air did, the way a cabin full of gaps and cracks and warped boards did. She looked at the rock face in front of her, 8 feet high, slightly curved, facing south, catching sun from morning through late afternoon. Behind it, the mountain rose enormous, impatient millions of tons of stone and earth in geological time. In front of it, the slope fell away toward the valley at an angle that would carry water downhill away from any structure built against the face. The prevailing wind came from the north and northwest, and the rock blocked it. The mountain itself was a windbreak. Rachel saw it, not all at once. The idea came the way water soaks into dry ground, one layer at a time, slow, irreversible. She saw a space carved into the slope, 3 walls of earth, a back wall of raw stone, a small fire, heat rising from the fire washing across the stone face, soaking into the rock, and then radiating back through the night, a low ceiling to hold the warmth close, a narrow entrance to keep the cold from rolling in. Not a cabin, not a house, something older, something the land itself would help build and maintain. She turned and looked down the slope at the cabin, thin smoke from the small chimney, light visible through gaps in the walls, Grace somewhere inside coughing. Rachel looked back at the stone. She placed her hand on it one more time, still warm. The sun had been down for 20 minutes and the stone was still warm. She picked up her shovel 2 days later on October 13th and began to dig. She worked before the children woke. 5 in the morning, the sky still dark, a single oil lamp set on a flat rock, casting a small circle of yellow light. The mountain loomed above her, black against the stars. She drove the shovel into the earth and pulled. Drove and pulled, drove and pulled. The rhythm became everything. She did not think about James. She did not think about the law. She did not think about the women in the valley whispering about her or the men shaking their heads. She thought about the next shovelful of dirt. She worked after feeding the children. Grace was old enough to watch Thomas inside the cabin for several hours at a time, and Rachel gave strict instructions. Do not leave the cabin. Do not open the door for anyone except me. Keep the fire small. I will be just up the hill. If you need me, come to the door and call. I will hear you. Grace nodded. She did not ask why her mother was digging a hole in the mountain. She understood in the wordless way that children understand the gravity of adult desperation, that her mother was doing something important, something that mattered more than explanations. Rachel dug until she could no longer see, until the oil lamp burned low and the darkness pressed in, and her arms shook so badly she could not grip the shovel. Then she walked down the slope, washed her hands in water that was already cold enough to sting, and went inside the cabin to sit with her children by the dying fire. The first foot of soil was soft, loose, the decomposed surface layer of mountain dirt mixed with pine needles and the remnants of seasons of organic decay. After that came the clay. Dense, heavy, packed so tightly that each shovel stroke moved only a few inches of material. Red-brown clay that stuck to the blade and had to be scraped off before the next stroke. Rachel used the iron poker, a 3-foot rod of solid iron, originally meant for stirring coals and adjusting burning logs to pry loose the stones embedded in the clay. Small stones she tossed aside. Larger ones she rolled out of the excavation by hand, bracing her feet against the slope and pushing with her legs because her arms did not have the strength. Her palm blistered on the first day. 4 blisters on the right hand, 2 on the left. By the second day, the blisters broke. Raw skin against the wooden handle of the shovel, a sharp, wet pain that flared with every grip and release. She tore strips from an old cotton shirt, wrapped her hands, and kept digging. The cloth soaked through with fluid from the blisters, and then with blood from the cracks that opened beneath them. By the 4th day, the cloth was stiff and brown, and her hands had begun to form the calluses that would define them for the rest of her life. Her shoulders burned. not the clean burn of muscles working, a deep ache that settled into the joint where bone met bone and radiated outward through her arms and up into her neck. Her lower back seized each morning so severely that she could not stand straight for the first 10 minutes of the day. She moved through those minutes slowly bending and straightening one vertebra at a time, like a woman much older than her 32 years. She did not complain. There was no one to complain to and no purpose in it if there had been. Grace came up the slope on the fourth day and stood at the edge of the excavation. She watched her mother drive the shovel into the clay pull lift, throw the dirt to the side. Drove, pull, lift, thou, throw. The same motion repeated 1,000 times. "What are you building, Mama?" Rachel stopped. She looked at her daughter. Grace's face was thin and serious. Her coat was too big, handed down from a neighbor's child 2 years ago. Her eyes held the particular quality of a 7-year-old who has learned that the world is not always safe and that the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes leave. "A new home for us," Rachel said. Grace looked at the hole in the hillside. She looked at the raw earth walls, the dark stone face at the back, the pile of clay and rocks growing beside the entrance. She did not say it looks like a hole. She did not say that is not a house. She looked at it for a long time with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and then she nodded once the way her mother nodded and walked back to the cabin to watch Thomas. By October 20th, after 7 days of digging, the excavation was 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The back wall was the natural rock face, the same stone Rachel had first touched 9 days earlier. Dark gray granite with veins of quartz that caught the lamplight and threw it back in small, bright sparks. She left the stone completely exposed. No plaster, no covering, no attempt to make it look like something it was not. This wall was the heart of everything she was building, and she would not hide it behind anything. On October 23rd, Henry Dawson rode past on the trail above the old cabin. He was heading south to check on a steer that had wandered off, and his path took him along the upper ridge where the homestead claim met the beginning of the mountain slope. He saw Rachel on the hillside. He stopped his horse. She was standing waist-deep in the excavation, the shovel moving in its relentless rhythm. Her hair was tied back and covered with a cloth. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and her forearms were streaked with red clay. She looked like someone who had been buried and was digging herself out. "Mrs. Hadley," he called down. His voice was flat, not mocking but not gentle either. The voice of a man stating what he saw. "You are burying yourself." Rachel did not look up. "I am staying warm. That is not a home. That is a hole in a hill." "I need heat," she said. Her voice was steady, unhurried, carrying the calm of absolute certainty. "And I need it to last." Henry watched her for a moment longer. Then he shook his head, the slow, side-to-side motion of a man who has seen something he does not understand and has decided not to try. He turned his horse and started down the trail. But halfway down he stopped. He did not turn around. He sat still on the horse and he listened. Behind him the sound of the shovel continued. Steady, rhythmic. The sound of a woman who had made a decision and was not interested in anyone else's opinion about it. Henry Dawson rode on. But that night, sitting beside his own stove in his own cabin, feeling the cold press through the walls like a living thing, he thought about Rachel Hadley standing in a hole on the side of a mountain with blistered hands and clay on her arms. And he could not decide whether she was the bravest woman he had ever seen or the most desperate, and he wondered if there was even a difference. Nettie Farrow came in late October. She was the oldest woman in the valley, around 60, a widow for 8 years, living alone in a small cabin at the far edge of the settlement. Her husband had died during the brutal winter of 1869, and Nettie had survived alone for 3 weeks, with snow piled to the roof and no one able to reach her. She burned her furniture that winter, the table her husband had built, the chairs, the small shelf he had carved for her kitchen. She burned them all and was still cold. Nettie did not ride a horse. She walked. She arrived at the excavation site carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a jar of rendered goose grease. "For your hands," she said, holding it out. "It will help the skin heal faster." Rachel took it. She did not say thank you right away. She looked at Nettie's face, at the deep lines around her eyes and mouth, at the steady gaze of a woman who had survived things that most people only imagined. There was no pity in that face, no judgment, no carefully worded suggestion about taking the children somewhere safer. Just recognition. one survivor looking at another. Nettie stepped into the excavation. She moved carefully, her joints stiff, but her balance sure. She walked to the back wall and placed her hand on the stone. She stood there for a long time, palm flat against the dark granite, her eyes closed. "My husband died in the middle of winter," she said quietly. "Snow to the roofline. No one came for 3 weeks. I burned every piece of wood in the cabin. Then I burned the furniture, the table he made for me, the chairs, and still the cold came through the walls like it owned the place." She opened her eyes and looked at Rachel. "If I had known about this back then, I might still have that table." She patted the stone wall once gently, the way you pat a horse's neck. Then she walked out of the excavation and started down the slope toward her own cabin without saying goodbye. She did not need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. By November 1st, the dugout had taken its final shape. 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep, 7 feet tall at the center, sloping down to 6 feet at the entrance. The back wall curved slightly, following the natural contour of the rock, faced raw and dark and ancient. The side walls were packed earth solid and smooth, where Rachel had tamped them with the flat of the shovel. She positioned the cook stove 3 feet forward from the stone wall, angled slightly so the mouth of the firebox faced the room while the body of the stove directed heat toward the rock face behind it. This distance was critical, and she spent 2 days adjusting it. Too close, and the heat would sink deep into the stone, absorbed into the mountain's infinite mass and effectively lost. Too far, and the rising hot air would never reach the wall with enough intensity to warm it. At 3 feet, the heat rose from the stove, hit the low ceiling, spread outward, and washed across the stone wall in a slow wave before circulating back into the room. The stone absorbed the surface heat gradually, and when the fire died, that stored heat radiated back into the space, slowly, steadily, through the entire night. The roof took 5 days. Rachel cut timber poles from small pines, dragging each one up the slope by hand. She laid them across the top of the excavation close together, then wove smaller branches between them. On top of this frame, she laid thick sections of sod cut from the hillside. Each section was heavy, dense with roots and soil, and carrying them to the roof was the most physically demanding work she had done in her life. Her arms shook, her legs buckled twice. She fell once and lay on the slope for a full minute, breathing hard, staring at the sky before she pushed herself up and continued. The sod roof was alive. The roots held the soil together. The soil absorbed rain and shed it slowly. The dense earthen layer insulated against cold from above the same way the earthen walls insulated from the sides. Beneath the sod, the woven branch layer created a small air gap, an additional barrier between the cold above and the warmth below. The entrance was low, about 5 feet, and narrow, wide enough for one person to pass through at a time. It faced south. Cold air is heavy, it sinks. Warm air is light, it rises. A low, narrow entrance on the south side of a structure built into a north-facing slope meant that cold air had to climb uphill to enter, working against its own nature. Warm air inside the dugout naturally collected at the ceiling and stayed there. Just outside the doorway, Rachel dug a shallow trench 6 inches deep and 2 feet wide, running across the full width of the entrance. Cold air flowing down the slope at night would settle into this trench and pool there instead of sliding through the doorway and into the dugout. A simple detail, no engineering degree required, just observation. Just the memory of standing in the doorway of the cabin on cold mornings and feeling the cold roll past her ankles like water. The floor was packed earth, tamped hard and smooth, covered with a layer of dry pine needles and straw collected from the field below the cabin. The pine needles and straw trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, and trapped air was insulation. From the outside, the finished dugout was nearly invisible. A low mound of earth and grass on the hillside, distinguishable from the natural slope only if you knew what you were looking for. A narrow, dark opening like the mouth of a small cave. A thin chimney pipe made from rolled clay, rising 2 feet above the sod roof and angled away from the prevailing wind. Inside the space was small, close, and dominated by the stone wall that filled the entire back. In the lamplight, the wall was alive with texture. Rough planes of granite, veins of white quartz, patches of darker mineral that absorbed the light and gave nothing back. It looked like something that had been there since before humans walked this land. Because it had. On November 4th, Rachel moved the children in. She carried the stove up the slope piece by piece, disassembling the flue and the legs and the ash door, and carrying each part separately because the assembled stove was too heavy for one person. She carried the blankets, the cooking pots, the small sack of flour, the dried beans, the salt, the tin cups, the iron skillet, Thomas's wooden horse carved by James the first winter, Grace's battered copy of McGuffey's Reader. Grace stepped inside. She stood in the center of the dugout and looked around. Low ceilings she could almost touch if she raised her hand. Stone wall at the back, cold now waiting. Earthen walls on the sides, smooth and brown. The smell of soil and pine needles and something older, something mineral and deep. It is small, Grace said. Her voice was quiet, not a complaint, an observation. It is warm, Rachel said. That is what matters. That night, Rachel built the first fire. Small, modest. The kind of fire you build when you are not sure what will happen and you want to watch before you commit. She fed it slowly, one piece of split pine at a time, letting the heat build gradually. And she watched. No drafts. For the first time in 3 years of Montana winters, no drafts. No cold fingers of air reaching through gaps in the walls and stealing heat from the room. The heat from the small fire filled the space quickly. It had nowhere to go and no way to escape. It rose to the ceiling, spread outward, reached the stone wall, and began to soak in. 2 hours later, the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals. Rachel did not add more wood. Instead, she placed her hand on the stone wall. Warm, not hot, not sharp. A deep, steady, radiant warmth that came from inside the stone itself. Heat that had soaked in over 2 hours and would now radiate outward for the next 8 or 10. The stone did not let go of heat the way air did, quickly and carelessly. The stone held it, on the walls. Just 2 children breathing on the walls. Just 2 children breathing evenly in a warm, dark, quiet space that smelled of earth and pine and wood smoke and safety. Rachel sat alone with her back against the warm stone wall. She closed her eyes and pressed her shoulders into the rock, feeling the heat soak through her shirt and into her skin and down into muscles that had been clenched with cold and fear and effort for weeks. She let it in, and she allowed herself one thought she had been afraid to think. They might survive this winter. She did not say it out loud. She did not celebrate. She simply let the thought exist in the darkness behind her closed eyes, small and fragile and real. Like a candle flame in a room with no wind. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The valley was quiet. Winter was settling in for the long stay. But inside the dugout, the stone wall was warm. The children were sleeping, and Rachel Hadley was no longer afraid. The valley did not notice at first. In a landscape that large, with homesteads spread miles apart, and November closing in like a fist, people paid attention to their own survival and left others to theirs. Most assumed Rachel Hadley had left. The cabin stood empty, no smoke from the chimney, no tracks in the fresh snow that began falling in the second week of November. Walter Parrish told his wife that the Hadley woman had finally shown some sense and gotten out before the real cold arrived. No one imagined she was still there. No one imagined she was living inside the mountain. It was mid-November when the signs became impossible to ignore. Henry Dawson, riding the upper trail to check on cattle, saw footprints in fresh snow leading from the creek up the ridge to a place where no cabin stood. He followed the tracks and found a thin line of smoke rising from the ground itself from a narrow clay chimney pipe, barely visible against the brown and white of the hillside. Thin smoke, pale and steady. Not the thick, dark clouds that every other chimney in the valley produced the desperate signature of families feeding their stoves everything they had. He dismounted and walked to the low entrance. He could feel the warmth before he reached it, a faint exhalation of heated air from the narrow opening, as if the mountain was breathing. "Mrs. Hadley," he called. Rachel appeared at the entrance. Her face was calm. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled, no coat, no shawl. In mid-November, Henry looked at her bare forearms and processed this information slowly. "You are serious about this," he said. "I am surviving," she said. "What about moisture? What about the roof? When the snow piles up, what then?" "The roof is solid. The weight is distributed across the timber frame, and the water drains downhill. It has been draining downhill for 1,000 years. I did not change the slope." Henry stared at her. He wanted to argue. But she was standing in front of him without a coat in November, and she was not cold. He shook his head and left. Word spread the way it always did in small communities. Not through announcements, but through whispers at the Sunday gathering, at the general store, at the places where valley people cross paths. She is living in a hole in the ground. That is no place for children. Someone should do something. Reverend Amos Tucker raised the matter after a Sunday service in late November. He was 48, a man of firm convictions and neat handwriting, who believed that order was next to godliness, and that a woman living in a hole was neither orderly nor godly. He did not say this directly. He spoke about the responsibility of the community to its weakest members. He spoke about the duty of Christian neighbors. He spoke about the safety of children. Everyone knew who he meant. Dorothy Selden caught Rachel outside the gathering afterward. "Rachel, I am worried. Are the children safe?" "They are warm." "Warm is not the same as safe." "In Montana in winter," Rachel said, "it is exactly the same thing." Dorothy hesitated, then said what she had been told to say by women who did not have the nerve to say it themselves. "If you need help, there are families who would take Grace and Thomas, just for the winter, until you have something more permanent." Rachel was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger. Something colder than anger. Certainty. "My children stay with me." She turned and walked toward the ridge. Dorothy watched her go, shivering slightly in a way that Rachel had not been. Frank Jessup arrived at the dugout in late November. He was 55, the Valley's unofficial elder, a former Union soldier who had fought at Gettysburg and carried shrapnel in his left thigh that ached before every storm. He had said nothing publicly about Rachel for weeks. He listened. He watched. He formed no opinions that he shared with anyone. He walked to the ridge on foot. A man on horseback arrives as an authority. A man on foot arrives as a neighbor. He stood before the entrance and called her name. Rachel came out. "May I come inside?" Frank asked. Rachel stepped aside. Frank removed his hat and ducked through the entrance. The warmth was immediate, not a blast of heat from a roaring stove, something subtler and more impressive. Warmth that came from the space itself, from the walls, from the stone, from the earth. He walked to the stone wall and placed his hand flat against the surface. "Warm," he said. "The stone absorbs heat from the fire," Rachel said. "Then it releases it slowly through the night." Frank nodded. He looked at Grace reading her book by candlelight. He looked at Thomas arranging small stones on the floor into shapes only he understood. Neither child was cold. Neither child was distressed. "The children seem well," Frank said. "They are warm," Rachel said. Frank put his hat back on and stepped outside. He stood in the cold and looked at the dugout, the mound of earth, the thin chimney, the narrow, dark entrance. "I will not say you are right," he said, "but I will not say you are wrong." Then he walked home. And in the valley, those two sentences from Frank Jessup functioned as a shield. They meant leave her alone. They meant the next person who suggests taking her children should think carefully. December came and the cold deepened. Nights dropped into the teens. Frost formed on the inside walls of every cabin in the valley. Stoves burned constantly, consuming wood at rates that made men wince. Rachel burned one small fire each evening. She lit it after dinner, fed it for 2 to 3 hours, and let it die. By morning, the stone wall had released enough stored heat to keep the dugout in the mid-50s, while cabins in the valley sat in the low 30s, while families slept in coats, while children woke with frost in their hair. Walter Parrish came in early December. He had resisted for weeks, refusing to dignify the dugout with his professional attention. But his own cabin had dropped to 28 degrees the previous night, despite a fire that consumed half a cord, and his wife had looked at him with an expression that said something had to change. He examined the structure with a carpenter's eye, tested the roof poles, pressed the earthen walls, studied the drainage trench, inspected the chimney. Then he went inside. He stood in the warm space and felt the heat enter his body through every surface, through his skin and his clothes and the soles of his boots. He understood immediately that he had been wrong. Not about a detail, about the fundamental concept. "I will admit," he said, crouching because the ceiling was lower than he was tall, "it is warmer than I expected." Then he added, because he was Walter Parrish and could not yield without a condition, "But it will not last. That roof will compact under snow. You will get leaks." "I accounted for the weight," Rachel said. He left unconvinced, but unsettled. Then Rachel had the night she never told anyone about. It came in mid-December, a few days before the great storm. The children were asleep. The fire had burned down. The dugout was warm and dark and quiet. And in the quiet, the things Rachel had been refusing to feel for 2 months broke through the wall she had built inside herself, the way water breaks through a dam that is held too long. She thought about James, not with anger. The anger had burned off weeks ago, consumed like fuel. She thought about the last time she had truly believed him. Was it the first year, the second? Or had she never fully believed, only chosen to because believing was easier than facing the alternative when you had two small children and no horse and nowhere else to go? She thought about Grace's cough. It had improved since moving into the dugout. But what if Grace got truly sick? What if the cough came back worse? There was no doctor within 30 miles. No medicine except what grew wild on the hillside. If something happened to Grace in the middle of a February blizzard, Rachel would have nothing but warm stone and her own two hands. She thought about Thomas falling. The entrance slope was steep and icy in the morning vogs. A 4-year-old boy on ice. One slip, one crack of a small skull against rock. She thought about the roof. Walter had said it would fail. Walter was wrong about many things, but he was not wrong about everything. What if he was right about this? What if the sod compacted under 3 feet of snow and the timber buckled and the whole thing came down in the middle of the night on top of her children, burying them in the dark? She pressed her back against the stone wall. Still warm, always warm, and she closed her eyes and felt the tears come. Not many, not long, just enough to acknowledge what she had been carrying alone for 65 days. The weight of being the only person standing between her children and everything that could go wrong. The weight of having no one to share a decision with, no one to say you are doing the right thing, no one to take a turn so she could rest. She cried in the dark with her back against warm stone, and her children sleeping 5 feet away, and the Montana winter pressing against the earth above her head. She cried for 5 minutes, maybe less. Then she opened her eyes. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Thomas turned in his sleep and murmured something she could not hear. Grace breathed evenly, her chest rising and falling, without a single cough. The wall was warm against her shoulders. Rachel pulled her blanket over herself and slept. In the morning, she woke and built the fire and cooked breakfast and checked the roof and carried water from the creek and did everything she did every day in exactly the same way. No one knew about the night before. No one needed to. It was hers. The only thing in her life that belonged entirely to her and cost her nothing to keep. Then the storm came. December 18th. The temperature dropped fast in the late afternoon, falling like a stone through water. By midnight, 12 below zero. By dawn, 15 below. The wind arrived with the cold, steady, and horizontal driving snow sideways across the valley. The kind of cold that found every weakness in every structure and exploited it without mercy. The valley went to war. At the Selden cabin, water froze solid in the bucket by midnight. Dorothy slept fully dressed under 3 quilts and still shivered. At the Dawson place, Henry burned his stove full blast for 12 hours, and the main room never climbed above 32 degrees. He sat in a chair beside the stove all night, coat on hat, on watching his breath form clouds inside his own home. At the parish cabin, the chimney downdrafted at 2 in the morning, filling the room with smoke so thick Walter had to open the door. The cold rushed in like a wall of water. It took 3 hours to recover. The cabin never got above 35 for the rest of the storm. At Frank Jessup's place, the water pipes burst. Ice spread across the floor and had to be chopped out with a hatchet. Reverend Tucker's cabin fared no better. The man who had spoken about community responsibility and the safety of children spent 3 nights in a room that hovered at 30 degrees, kneeling on a frozen floor to pray for the storm to break, his knees aching on ice that had no business being inside a home where a man of God lived. The storm lasted 3 days. Inside the dugout, Rachel built one small fire each evening, the same fire she always built, the same amount of wood. The mountain blocked the wind. The earth held the warmth. The stone wall absorbed heat and gave it back. The first night, the temperature inside reached 68 degrees while the fire burned. By morning, after the fire had been out for 7 hours, it had dropped to 52. Outside, 15 below zero. The second night, the same. Rachel added 2 extra sticks because the cold was deeper. The room reached 65. By morning, 51. Outside, 14 below. The third night, Grace pressed her palm against the stone wall before bed. She had begun doing this each night, a ritual, not checking for something frightening, checking for something reassuring. "Still warm," she said and smiled. "Yes," Rachel said. "It will stay warm." Thomas slept through all 3 nights without waking. He kicked his blanket off on the second night because he was too warm. When the storm broke on December 21st, the valley emerged exhausted. Wood supplies were critically low. People looked worn and gray. They had survived. That was all. From the ridge, thin smoke rose from a clay chimney pipe. Steady, unhurried. The smoke of sufficiency. 2 days later, Walter Parrish rode up to the dugout. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" he asked. His voice had changed. The professional condescension was gone. "About a quarter cord," Rachel said. Walter stared. "I burned 2 cords, and my cabin never got above 40. Rachel stepped aside. "Come inside." He stepped through the doorway and the warmth hit him. Steady, enveloping warmth. He walked to the stone wall and placed both hands flat against it. Warm, deep warmth from inside the rock. "You are using the mountain," he said quietly. "The stone holds heat," Rachel said. "Then it releases it slowly. All night." Walter looked at the stove, the entrance to the ceiling. He was calculating. "That is a 60-degree difference from outside, with one fire." Rachel nodded. Walter stood in the dugout for a long time. Then he said what cost him more than any words he had ever spoken. "I was wrong, completely wrong." Rachel did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of the weeks of mockery. She simply stood in the space she had built with the shovel in her own bleeding hands and allowed the silence to hold what both of them now understood. "Would you show me how to build this?" he asked. Rachel nodded, one nod, calm without triumph, a woman agreeing to share what she knew with a man who was finally ready to hear it. After that, things changed. Dorothy Selden came with a thermometer. 65 degrees inside, 19 outside. She stood in the dugout holding the thermometer and did not speak for a long time. Then she said 2 words. "I apologize." Henry Dawson returned with detailed questions. Measurements, depth, stone type, roof layers, stove distance. He wrote everything down on a piece of paper with a carpenter's pencil. On January 14th, another cold snap hit. 8 below zero. Cabins struggled to stay above freezing. Rachel's dugout held in the mid-50s by morning. Walter came again. "You use a third of the wood we use, and you are warmer, sometimes 20 degrees warmer." "Sometimes more," Rachel said. Walter was quiet for a while. Then he asked again with a different weight behind the words. "Would you show me how?" Rachel nodded. The same nod, the same calm. The valley had shifted, not with applause, not with praise, with the quiet rearrangement of understanding that happens when evidence finally overwhelms opinion. And winter was not finished. But for the first time, the valley was not afraid of what came next. They had placed their hands on warm stone and understood that something fundamental had changed. Rachel did not say any of this. She did not need to. The stone said it for her, warm and steady and patient all night long. By late January of 1878, the truth had become as solid as the stone wall that had created it. Numbers do not argue. Numbers do not whisper behind hands at Sunday gatherings. Numbers simply exist plain and unanswerable, and the numbers that winter were these. Rachel Hadley burned roughly 1/3 the wood consumed by any other family in the valley. Her shelter maintained temperatures 40 to 60 degrees above the outside air. Her children had not been sick once since moving into the dugout, and her method required no special materials, no imported technology, no expertise beyond a willingness to observe what the land already offered and the endurance to act on that observation. Walter Parrish was the first to build. His pride had cost him a winter of cold nights and a chimney full of smoke and a family that slept in their coats for 3 months. He did not intend to repeat the experience. His land lacked the steep rock face that Rachel had used, but the terrain behind his cabin rose gradually, and Walter was a carpenter. What he lacked in natural features, he could compensate for with skill. He spent the spring and summer of 1878 redesigning his home. He cut into the hillside behind the cabin, removing the entire back wall of pine logs that he had built 4 years earlier. Beneath the soil and the rotting wood, he found what he needed. A layer of granite not vertical like Rachel's wall, but angled solid and dense in waiting. He exposed the stone, cleaned it, left it bare. He moved his stove forward and angled it toward the rock. He packed earth along the exterior sides of the cabin and sealed every gap with a mixture of clay and animal fat. It was not a dugout, it was a cabin with a stone heart. And the following winter, his main room stayed 12 degrees warmer than it had ever been. He burned half the wood. His wife woke to liquid water in the bucket every morning and considered it something close to a miracle. Henry Dawson went further. He chose a south-facing slope on the eastern edge of his property and dug a full semi-dugout following Rachel's design. Stone back wall, sod roof, narrow entrance, cold air trench. He positioned his stove 3 feet from the wall because Rachel had told him the measurement, and he saw no reason to second-guess a woman who had spent an entire winter proving she was right. By November of 1878, he moved in. When someone asked him that winter how the new shelter was working, he said 4 words that carried more weight than a sermon. "I sleep through the night." Dorothy Selden did not dig. She hired Walter's eldest son to rebuild the north wall of her cabin using flat stones from the creek bed. She repositioned her stove to face the stone. The work was rough. The wall was uneven. But on the coldest night of that winter, her cabin held at 48 degrees instead of 32. 16 degrees, the difference between ice in the bucket and liquid water. The difference between sleeping fully dressed and sleeping under a quilt in a nightgown. She sat beside the stone wall one evening in February and placed her hand on its warm surface and thought about the day she had suggested that other families should raise Rachel's children. The memory sat in her chest like a stone of a different kind. Shame. The kind that does not fade. Reverend Tucker made no modifications to his cabin that first year. He watched the others with an expression that shifted slowly from disapproval to discomfort to something resembling grudging acknowledgement. By the second winter, he had Walter's second son stack stone along the interior of his north wall. He never mentioned it in sermons. He never credited Rachel. But his cabin was warmer, and on the coldest nights when he knelt to pray, his knees no longer ached on a frozen floor. That was enough theology for him. By the winter of 1879, 11 families in the valley had adopted some version of Rachel's design. Some dug full dugouts, some added stone walls, some rebuilt entirely. Nobody called it engineering. They called it building like Rachel. Rachel never charged for her knowledge. She never advertised. She never walked through the valley offering unsolicited advice. But when someone came with questions, she answered. Every question, in full. With the patience of a woman who understood that knowledge shared was not diminished, but multiplied. She explained simply, stone holds heat, earth insulates. Small spaces stay warm longer than large ones. A narrow entrance keeps cold air out. A south-facing opening catches winter sun. Work with the land instead of fighting it. The land has been here longer than you. It knows things you do not. Listen to it. She never said, "I told you so." Not once, not to anyone. That was the quality people respected most. Not her intelligence, not her toughness. The grace to be proven right and to wear that rightness lightly. To hold no grudges. To share freely with the same people who had doubted her. Frank Jessup understood this. He had watched the entire arc. In early April of 1878, at the first community gathering after the spring thaw, he stood up. Frank did not stand often. When he did, the valley listened. "I want to say something about the Hadley claim." The group went still. Reverend Tucker shifted in his seat. "The law says the claim belongs to James Hadley. James Hadley is not here. He has not been here since October. He left his wife and children with nothing." He paused. He looked around the room. "His wife is here. She has been here through a winter that tested every single one of us. Some of us burned through our entire wood supply. Some of us could not keep our homes above freezing. Some of us spent 3 days in conditions that I would not inflict on a man I disliked." Another pause. Rachel Hadley built a shelter from nothing, with a shovel and an iron poker in her own 2 hands. She kept her children warm through that same storm with one small fire each night. She used less wood in the entire winter than most of us used in a month. She did it alone, without help, without a horse, without money, without the legal right to the land she was standing on. He let the silence hold. Who among us built anything better? Who among us survived this winter more capably? Who among us can stand here and say that woman does not belong on that piece of ground? Silence, deep and complete. The kind that fills a room when a truth has been spoken that everyone already knew but no one had been willing to say. Frank sat down. No one responded. No vote was taken. None was needed. In the valley, Frank Jessup's words were law in the way that mattered most. The weight of moral authority spoken by a man who had earned it through decades of honest judgment. No one filed a competing claim on the Hadley land. No one suggested Rachel leave. The topic simply ceased to exist. Spring and summer passed. Rachel planted potatoes, beans, and corn in the clearing below the dugout entrance. Grace helped. She was 8 now, taller, stronger, moving with the efficient purpose of a child who had learned that work was not punishment, but survival. She knew how to check the sod roof for compression. She knew how to clear the drainage trench. She knew which rocks on the hillside would crack in the frost and which would hold. Thomas was 5. He drew on the stone wall with charcoal, small figures stick-legged and round-headed. A horse, a sun with long rays, a woman who was always the tallest figure in every drawing, standing in the center, arms spread wide. Rachel left every drawing on the wall. They accumulated through the months, a child's gallery on million-year-old granite east. The second winter passed more easily. Rachel knew the rhythms now. She knew how the stone behaved at different temperatures. She knew that on the coldest nights, a slightly larger fire would charge the stone with enough heat to last through dawn. She knew that on milder nights, she barely needed a fire at all. Nettie Farrow came once in January of that second winter. She was 61, moving slower, the cold in her joints, the kind that no longer left with the spring. She sat inside the dugout with a cup of hot mint water and placed her hand on the warm stone and smiled. "Still here," she said. It was not clear whether she meant Rachel or the warmth or herself. In the spring of 1879, a scare shook Rachel in a way that the entire winter had not. Thomas, now 5, had been playing outside the dugout entrance on a March morning when the frost was still thick on the slope. He slipped on ice at the edge of the drainage trench and tumbled down the hillside. Not far, perhaps 15 feet, but he hit a rock outcropping with his left arm, and Rachel heard the sound from inside the dugout, a short, sharp cry that stopped her heart between beats. She was outside in seconds. Thomas lay on the slope holding his arm, not screaming, which frightened her more than screaming would have. Children who are truly hurt sometimes go quiet. She knelt beside him and felt the arm carefully. Not broken. She knew what broken felt like. She had felt her own wrist break years ago when a horse threw her. This was not that. A deep bruise, a strain. But the arm was whole. She carried him inside and made a splint from 2 flat sticks and a strip of cloth, not because she was certain he needed one, but because certainty was a luxury she could not afford. She held him on her lap by the stove for an hour, his face pressed against her shoulder, his breathing gradually steadying. Grace sat across the room and watched without speaking, her face tight with the particular fear of an older sibling who understands what almost happened. That night, after both children were asleep, Rachel sat by the stove and her hands shook. Not from cold, from the delayed recognition of how close she had come to a disaster that could not be fixed with warm stone or steady fire or any amount of determination. If the arm had broken, if he had hit his head instead, if the fall had been 20 feet instead of 15. There was no doctor. There was no help. There was only her. She did not cry. She had spent her tears in December and had no more to offer the darkness. She simply sat and shook, and then when the shaking stopped, she went outside with a lantern and spent 2 hours in the cold, chipping footholds into the icy slope below the entrance and lining the edges of the drainage trench with flat stones that would provide grip in the frost. By morning, the path was safer. Not safe. Nothing was safe, but safer. That was all she could ever achieve. The second winter ended. The third began. Rachel expanded the dugout that summer, adding a small storage room and a sleeping space for the growing children. She kept the stone wall. She kept the stove 3 feet away. In 1880, the law changed. Montana territorial legislature passed a provision allowing single women to file homestead claims. Rachel learned of it through a letter from Calvin Rhodes. Short, formal, carefully worded. "Mrs. Hadley, recent changes to territorial law now permit you to file a homestead claim in your own name. Should you wish to do so, please visit the land office at your convenience." She walked the 7 miles to town on a Tuesday in late May. The same road she had walked 3 years earlier when Thomas rode on her back in a flour sack sling and Grace carried a walking stick. This time Thomas walked on his own. He was 6, sturdy, sure-footed, the bruise on his arm, long-healed, but the flat stone foothold still in place on the slope. Grace walked ahead, 10 years old now, but carrying herself with the quiet competence of someone twice her age. Calvin Rhodes stood when Rachel entered the land office. He did not need to, it was not required. But he stood, and when he slid the papers across the desk, his hand was steady and his eyes met hers with an expression she had not seen 3 years earlier. Something between respect and apology. "Sign here," he said, "and here." Rachel picked up the pen. She looked at the paper. Legal language describing property boundaries and obligations and rights. But beneath the words was something simpler. A correction. A piece of paper that said what the stone wall had been saying for 3 years. She signed, Rachel Hadley. The letters were firm and unhurried, pressed into the paper with the deliberate force of a woman who had waited a long time to write her own name on something that mattered. Calvin blotted the signature. He looked at her, and for a moment the professional mask slipped, and he was simply a man who had once told a woman that her labor did not count, and who now watched her sign a document that proved otherwise. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hadley," he said quietly. Rachel nodded. She took her children's hands and walked home. 7 miles, the same road, the same valley, but different in the way that everything is different when you finally own the ground you stand on. Through the early 1880s, the method spread beyond the valley. Prospectors heading into the high mountains carried the knowledge upward to elevations where winter was longer and more dangerous. They built small dugouts in mountain passes where previous prospectors had abandoned claims each October because they could not stay warm. Homesteaders on the plains adapted the principles to flat terrain, going down instead of sideways, using thicker sod and adobe bricks where stone was unavailable. There was no official name. Some called it mountain housing. Some called it dugout building. In the valley, the phrase was always the same: build like Rachel. A federal surveyor visited in the mid-1880s conducting a population and resource assessment. He was a methodical man who noted an anomaly in his report. Fuel consumption in this settlement was significantly lower than comparable communities. Homes were warmer. Residents appeared healthier. He called it local innovation. 2 words in a government document, the closest thing to official recognition Rachel would ever receive. Grace married in 1888. She was 18, tall and strong, with her mother's steady gaze. Her husband was a rancher named Samuel from 2 valleys east, a quiet man who listened more than he spoke. The home he built for them had a stone wall on the north side and a stove 3 feet from it. Grace did not explain why she insisted on this arrangement. She did not need to. Thomas left for Helena in 1889 to apprentice with a territorial surveyor. He was 16, old enough to work still carrying charcoal in his pocket. He had a gift for reading land, for understanding the relationship between slope and drainage and exposure. Skills no school had taught him. He learned them growing up inside a mountain, watching his mother study rock faces and position a stove with the precision of someone whose children's lives depended on the distance between iron and stone. When both children left, the dugout grew quiet. Rachel was 43. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her hands were calloused and permanently strong. She moved through her days with the economy of motion that comes from long practice. Fire in the evening, garden in the morning, repairs as needed. She was alone the way Nettie had been alone. Not from failure, but from completion. The children were grown. The work was done. She thought about James sometimes. Not often, not with anger or grief. He had become an absence so familiar it was a feature of the landscape. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She did not wonder. She had loved him once when his restlessness looked like ambition and his silence looked like depth. But love built on misinterpretation does not survive the correction. Once she saw clearly, the love did not become hatred. It simply evaporated the way frost evaporates from a window when the sun hits it. Quietly, completely, leaving the glass clear. Nettie passed away in the spring of 1880, not long after Rachel signed the land papers. Henry Dawson found her in her chair near the stove, wrapped in a quilt, looking peaceful. Rachel attended the burial on a hillside above Nettie's cabin. She stood near the edge of the group and thought about a jar of goose grease and a woman who had come without being asked and without offering advice. She thought about Nettie's hand on the stone wall. If I had known about this back then, I might still have that table. In the winter of 1891, the temperature dropped to 5 below 0. Rachel was 46. She sat in the dugout beside the stove alone, watching the flames reflect off the stone wall she had uncovered 14 years earlier. The same wall, the same quartz veins catching the light. Thomas's childhood drawings still visible in places faded to gray, but there if you knew where to look. The tall woman with spread arms. The sun with its long rays, 63 degrees inside. 5 below outside. One small fire. The same fire she had built every evening for 14 years. She placed her hand on the stone. Warm. Always warm. After 14 years, after hundreds of fires and thousands of hours of stored and released heat, the stone was warm. It would be warm tonight and tomorrow night and every night that someone lit a fire and gave the stone something to hold. The stone did not tire. The stone did not leave. The stone did not promise to return before the first snow and then disappear into the open land carrying everything of value. Rachel thought about what she had built. Not the dugout was a structure. What she had built was larger, an idea, a principle, a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the earth they lived on. She thought about Grace warm tonight in her stone-walled home, about Thomas reading the land in Helena with eyes she had trained, about Walter Parrish, who had spent a decade helping other families build shelters based on a design he once called a hole, about Henry Dawson sleeping through the night in his dugout, about Dorothy Selden, who had apologized with 2 words and meant them, about Frank Jessup, who had stood up in a room full of people and said what needed to be said, about Nettie Farrow, who now lay beneath the grass on a hillside, the woman who had brought goose grease and dignity when everyone else brought opinions and distance. The dugout stood for 23 years. In the spring of 1900, a landslide buried the entrance under 12 feet of earth and stone. By then, Rachel had moved to a small cabin near Grace's home. The cabin had a stone wall on the north side and a stove 3 feet from it. Of course it did. The dugout was gone, returned to the mountain. But the stone wall was still there under the earth in the darkness. It would always be there. Stone does not leave. Stone does not make promises it cannot keep. Stone holds what it is given and releases it slowly and faithfully and for as long as anyone needs it to. The idea did not disappear with the dugout. Ideas cannot be buried by landslides. The idea traveled outward, carried by people who had learned it from people who had learned it from a woman on a ridge who had dug into a mountainside with a shovel because her children were cold and she had no other choice. Rachel Hadley was not an engineer. She was not a scientist. She was not a pioneer in any way that history books recorded. She never appeared in a newspaper. She never gave a speech. She was a woman who had been left with nothing and who had built something from that. Nothing that changed how people lived. She was a woman who could not afford to be wrong, and sometimes that is where the best ideas in the world come from. Not from laboratories or universities or government commissions. From the place where a mother stands in the cold with 2 children and no money and no horse and no legal right to the ground beneath her feet and looks at a mountain and sees not an obstacle, but an answer. From the place where failure is not an abstract concept, but a specific threat measured in degrees and days and the sound of a child coughing in the dark. Rachel Hadley dug, and the mountain answered, and the stone remembered the sun.